Hi there. Welcome to Season 2 of the JAIAC's Dispute Management in a New World podcast series. I'm your host, Anika Nelson. In this episode, we will take a look back at some of the highlights from Season 1 and explore dispute management pandemic, the notion of a pandemic. Before we get into the highlights, let's introduce our astute guest, Dr. Christopher Malcolm. Dr. Malcolm has over 25 years' experience in dispute management globally. Welcome to Season 2.
Thank you, Nico.
All right, talk to us a little bit about the JAIAC's digital offerings.
The JAIAC offers online dispute management through the iNeutral platform. It is a new platform, and it has been innovated by us in the region, built out by us in the region, but is offered globally. And what it does is that it allows the parties to a dispute to take what would ordinarily be done in a physical space into an online space. And it is innovative in the sense that it offers end-to-end dispute management services, meaning you can start your process with iNeutral, you can do all the management aspects of a dispute resolution process there, and you can also have your hearings using iNeutral and ultimately get your published awards or other decisions also through the iNeutral platform.
So, Doc, the demand for technology has skyrocketed almost over the last couple of years. Are businesses at a greater risk with the use of technology?
Anything at all in life that you do would have benefits and concomitant detriments at the same time as well. So the businesses that use technology are not without detriments. What they need to do, however, is to ensure that they take adequate steps to protect themselves against known risks as well as against risks that may not be known but may be possible. And so it is an ongoing process where businesses must continually update their systems, do their performance and other audits to ensure that they are compliant and preparing themselves adequately to deal with emerging risks. Because one of the things about technology is that as it morphs and as it develops, with it emerges new risks. So you have to literally be on the forefront where technology is concerned.
So what about the regulators? Do they have a role as well to play in assisting businesses to kind of reduce some of those risks?
There is perhaps a multifaceted role for regulators, is how I would like to put it, in that they are there to ensure that people operate as they're expected to by reference to their licenses and by reference to whatever other mechanisms are in place for them to operate. But in addition, they're also there to assist the businesses, including ensuring that they remain compliant, one, but also that they remain on top of new developments in their own best interest. So regulators, you will see wherever you go globally, that they're very often involved in presenting conferences and presenting leadership guidance and other guidance to the businesses that come under the regulatory purview.
All right, so you spoke quite a bit about that in Season 1. So what we'll do is we'll allow persons to get a glimpse of some of the points that you alluded to in Season 1. When we come back, we will continue our discussion.
In any situation, try to understand what the likely risks for dispute would be. Try to understand as well how it is that you can manage that better to a common end. And if you do that well enough, you will get people talking to each other rather than fighting with each other. And when we say fight, it is not necessarily the literal fight. It could be figurative. It could be fight in a court of law. It could be fight in all sorts of contexts. And those things are critical because they are at the core of what war as distinct from peace becomes. And when we think of war and peace, we should not always think of it in terms of heavy artillery and so on. Peace is much more critical than that, in my view. Peace starts at the community level. And people may say it's utopian, but the truth is that many thoughts must begin in utopia. And if we don't have utopian vision, it is unlikely that we're going to get to what we practically can achieve in a good way anyway. So I don't have a difficulty being labeled utopian, and I don't have a difficulty with people saying, but those ideas are not achievable, because the truth is, it is very often the unachievable that we must strive for. We function in an environment where the first thing we learn is that ignorance of the law is no excuse. So if ignorance of the law is no excuse, it behoves us to ensure that we know what the law is, and those of us who understand it well enough also have a responsibility, I believe, to try to ensure that as many persons as are possible learn the law. And the learning of the law, in my view, because it is so all-encompassing and all-embracing, should start from as early as is possible and should become critical to the development of every child, of every person in the community. And that is what street law is about. In most jurisdictions where it has been developed and utilized, street law typically focuses on rule of law and human rights issues. But in our own context, and perhaps because of my own leaning in the area of economic development, I recognized and thought that the contribution that I could make, which is really novel, this is the novelty of the programs that we have brought to the Caribbean, should be one which was more focused on the area of economic rights and development. So for that reason, our program focuses on questions related to contracting, intellectual property rights, and so on. And you may ask, why intellectual property rights? In the context of the Caribbean, I always maintain that the real area of comparative advantage that we have is in the area of our creative industries, our intellectual property and things related to that.
Now, in episode 3 of season 1, we spoke about dispute management and the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, let's talk a little bit about some of the implications from that, and then we'll allow persons as well another opportunity to see a clip from that.
Well, it's interesting. In Jamaica, we have the expression, COVID still a keep. Meaning,
and indeed,
COVID is still going on.
Yes.
It's still with us. But what happened is that one of the things we mentioned then was the fact that with COVID, there is clearly a healthcare pandemic that has arisen out of it. And we're hearing now from entities that it has moved to the stage of being endemic. We've heard that said.
Yes.
And the truth, one of the things we sought to do then as well was to say, in addition to the fact that there's a pandemic related to COVID, there's also a likely, we thought then, and the position is in fact concretizing, that there's a dispute resolution pandemic that has arisen out of that. And that has, of course, to do with the fact that there are a number of contracts that are not being performed as they were intended to be performed, and a number of other issues that have come out of employment related and so on, that have come out of the COVID-19 pandemic. And it is in that context why we're saying that what has to happen very carefully for businesses and for everybody, quite frankly, is that you have to look carefully now to see what are the likely areas of risk from a dispute resolution perspective that are there, and to try to put measures in place that can allow for these risks to be dealt with, more likely than not, and hopefully in an amicable way. There are instances where you just can't avoid adversarial proceedings. But the hope is that if we think about it holistically, we will try to move towards the more mediative and other amicable methods of resolving what are inevitable disputes coming out of COVID, rather than allow them to morph, get worse, and then become subject to much more adversarial proceedings. We have seen in courts worldwide, and we have seen in other dispute management proceedings, that we're getting a number of disputes, many of them directly linked to the COVID pandemic in terms of contracts and so on that would have come about in terms of their breach and so on having arisen as a result of issues related to COVID.
All right, I'm going to ask you to just give us 1 or 2 examples right after we take a look at the flashback.
Depending on the size and complexity of your business, the nature of the disputes that you have to deal with could differ significantly from those of some entity that is smaller, depending on whether you're doing business that's purely domestic in a single jurisdiction or you're crossing border with your business. That could also have implications for the nature of it. I think as a matter of rule, bigger businesses, it is not unusual, let me put it that way, for bigger businesses to have in-house lawyers and other legal support persons within their organizations who would give them good advice and help them in their negotiations and in other elements of dispute management. Because we have to be careful that when we're speaking dispute management, we recall that we're not simply speaking about dispute resolution. Remember, we're talking about an end-to-end process.
Right.
From the point of idea through to implementation and all the things that flow between and after. So what we have happening is that where an entity has as part of its setup in-house counsel and other persons who are able to provide that sort of support, invariably, it makes it easier for them to have better dispute management service support at the beginning. The extent to which it happens will depend on the experience of the persons they have and the willingness as well of the persons they have on board to venture into new areas. So that's one thing. With smaller entities, this SME sector we call it, or even go beyond that, the micro, small and medium enterprise sector, especially at the micro level, do not have lawyers who are in-house or on board with them. So they very often will sort of farm out their dispute management or related needs. And it is not unusual in that sector to find that persons see legal services as a cost that they can do without bearing. So to that extent, it is not unusual then for them to engage in activities without having proper legal support from the beginning. And in a lot of instances, where lawyers get involved for them is at the end of dispute resolution. And by the time you get there are very often a lot of missteps along the way, which make the resolution process more difficult, right? So it can be said to that extent that bigger businesses may be ahead of smaller ones in terms of how prepared they are for dispute resolution. But you'd be surprised, there's some small entities that have recognized very early, or that recognize very early, that they need to have their lawyers on board as much as they do their accountants or anybody else. And so it always comes down to the nature of the business owners, what they prioritize, and how important they see the law coming in. And I think it is critical for us, as persons involved in the field, myself included, to the best we can, assist the MSME sector to an understanding of what law and dispute management can and should be to their operations. Help them to understand that we are not expenses that they should simply overlook, but to try to help them to understand how the services we provide can be leveraged by them in support of their business activities for good.
Earlier, we asked the question about giving us one or two examples of what you're seeing in terms of trends globally and the likelihood of a dispute management pandemic.
We've seen where businesses tend to be reliant on raw materials being sourced from diverse parts of the world. Now, when you have that happening, you now rely on a logistics and supply chain, which also focuses on the various dots across the world, right? Now, as a result of the pandemic, we saw where shipping lines, for example, were disrupted at one point or another. We have seen instances where there were, some of it, of course, related to the fact that in some countries, for example, you had lockdowns. People just couldn't go to work. Factories were shuttered and so on. So those things happened.
Some have not even recovered.
Some have not recovered. And once you shutter a factory, there's a long tail to it, you know. You don't just shut it today, problems arise tomorrow, and that's the end of it. The tail tends to drag on a bit. Now, I mention that because we've all been seeing come in the news, for example, leading up to Christmas 2021, that in the US, they've had a significant supply chain issue that has arisen as a result of ships coming out of China and elsewhere that have simply gone into California and other ports and simply cannot be cleared. And we have heard of the issues relating to that. We've heard of store shelves being empty of particular items and so on. What has that meant? That has meant that the ships that were engaged, for example, to do let's say a 2-month voyage, are now in a position where they're looking at 3-month voyages. You have workmen, seafarers who are there, who need to be paid and all that. They were contracted for a particular period. Now you have added costs being taken on account. You have, of course, all the storage and related issues being related to that. Then you have people who had contracted to get their goods produced to them within a particular time who can no longer get them.
And hopefully these aren't perishable items.
Hopefully they're not. But then you had also off-takers who are waiting. And what are you having? People being unable to meet their contracted for deliverables times and so on. Now, once that happens, you have contracts being breached. And if there are contracts being breached, people are going to be looking to see where they can recover because you want to pass off your liabilities or possible liabilities to somebody else, right? You want to distribute your losses.
Yes.
So all of that has created a whole chain of events which must be resolved one way or another, and their conflicts and their disputes. So that is one significant area, and that gives rise to a number of other issues. We also have other issues relating, for example, to employment. In instances where, in some places, for example, particular companies may have introduced mandates related to workplace mandates and so on, or workplace policies. Let us use policies, which is a much broader word than mandate. And those have created instances which could well be leading persons to question whether or not there are constitutional implications, and there are already court actions being taken in relation to that. Whether or not there are breach of contract issues, there are already court and related action being taken in concerning those matters. There are things relating to schools. Some schools not being open, students wondering whether or not they're getting the education they've paid for. Right. And of course, there have already been court actions relating to that. And we could multiply the examples throughout. And I think I may have already given 3.
Yes.
But there are a lot of things that are happening, and the tale has not yet got to its end, because other things are going to happen as one thing leads to another.
In terms of the global trends that we're seeing, what are some of the digital implications? Are persons going to be able to access arbitration and dispute resolution online to solve some of those issues that they're having?
Going digital is inevitable and has already happened and is happening, and I suspect it's going to become even more pervasive as we proceed. And how has it already been recognized, even in outside of alternative dispute resolution institutions and what is happening there? We have seen, for example, the courts in jurisdictions across the world that have moved steadily more and more into using Zoom, WebEx, and GoTo and all sorts of other online services as a method of allowing hearings to continue. You also had instances where the services provided by courts were limited, and in some instances, courts were in some jurisdictions even shuttered for a while. But the truth is, and the fact is, that you need the courts to assist persons in their everyday lives. There are persons who are subject to domestic and other abuse. There are persons who need injunctions. There are persons who need all sorts of protective and other orders from the court. And without the court being able to provide this constitutional function, which is required to do in the best interest of the citizen, you have a lacuna or a gap being created, which, if you're not careful, could result in jungle justice, which you don't want anywhere at all. So the courts have had to themselves become responsive to the times and have, as a result, also themselves gone ahead and ensure that they put greater measures in place to rely in a more significant way on digital resources. Now, in the context now of institutions outside of the court, let's go now to the field of alternative dispute resolution, which is, for example, in the case of the JAIAC and other such institutions. It has also been recognized that the idea of physical hearings was for a time difficult to accommodate, if at all. And as persons realize, and as the pandemic continued, you realize more and more that the difficulties, even after some travel restrictions and so on were lifted, the restrictions being placed from one country to another, particularly for persons who were in the business of doing international arbitrations, mediations, and so on, where you had to cross borders physically for travel. Those persons recognized that the space was becoming more and more difficult to navigate. Parties still needed to have their disputes resolved. And there were some disputes where the matters were already in train and needed to be completed. What then would you have to do? So there had to be a sensible decision taken, which was, let us use the services that are available to us. Online was available, so let us now adapt those mechanisms if we need to adapt them, and let us now see how we can best use them with the necessary protections that are required so persons can use them. So the short answer, then getting back to where we started, is that online is here with us. I suspect it is here to stay. I don't see us going back. And we have heard...
But people are clamoring to go back.
Well, persons are clamoring to go back, but we've also heard courts from across the world, including in our own Caribbean jurisdiction and jurisdictions far and wide, big and small as the countries are, saying that we're not ever going to go back to what we knew before, and that we're never ever going to completely get rid of some of the benefits that we've been able to derive from going online. And let me tell you, while it is true that people are clamoring,
yes,
because face-to-face is something people want,
yes,
and people sometimes feel a lot more comfortable when you can eyeball people and you can see how they're responding and so on. The truth is that there are significant areas of efficiencies that have come out of online. So while it is that somebody may say, boy, I'm clamoring to have a physical hearing, it's not the same as saying I'm clamoring to have a physical case management conference, which is quite frankly something which is paper-based. You go there, you have some fairly standard orders and so on being made. The question is, why should you have to be face-to-face to do that? Why can't you be in your office? And there's also the element, of course, of cost. So while people may be clamoring, and probably in domestic contexts, when you're thinking about international matters where you know you'll be traveling sometimes great distances and with great dislocation,
Traffic,
with great cost. I'm talking about going across borders
yes,
as well,
yes,
with great cost, with great dislocation at one level or another. And you're thinking about that and thinking that there are ways that you may be able to shorten these proceedings or to make them cheaper. Then clearly persons are now rethinking, even if not to get rid completely of physical hearings, which we probably will not. Persons are now thinking, how can we hybridize these processes to ensure that we get the best of all worlds?
How can the man in the street better manage his risk from being online and so on? How can they do that better?
Well, the man in the street is reliant on systems being put in place by others who know better and who are in the business. And I think this is where as well we have to recognize that as COVID has happened, and even before that, you have people who develop specializations, and we have to learn to rely on specialists. I myself, if you ask me to code an online dispute resolution platform, I would never be able to do it. That's not my discipline. I don't know anything about it. However, if you ask me to look at a statute and be able to have a fairly good understanding of how it might be interpreted and applied, I could do that. I have a training in that area. So what we have to start doing, and the man in the street has to now be educated to understand that there are some things that we can do, but there are other things that we should be prepared to rely on others for. And I think that also there's a space also in that for government, in that government now needs to ensure that appropriate measures are taken to ensure that there's adequate protection for data, there's adequate protection for those persons who are offering services, so you don't have every Tom, Dick, and Harry offering a service probably in circumstances where they're not capable. So there's a new discussion that has to be had, and a new level of engagement, including with the man in the street and including with our policymakers, to ensure that we're getting the best protection possible.
It sounds to me that if you intend to do business in the 21st century, or today, next year, going forward, you have to have dispute management as part of your vision, as part of your planning. Is that something that you would agree with?
Once you get into a relationship of any sort, whether it is personal or commercial, whether it is involving ordinary businesses or involving states, as in countries, you are going to have divergent positions. Mm-hmm. And once you have divergent positions, what you have is the possibility of a conflict. The positions are conflicting.
Yes.
They're not. Once positions are not equal and the same, they are by nature in conflict with each other. Mm-hmm. The question that arises is not whether you have conflicts, but how you go about managing those conflicts, right, so they don't morph into something that gets worse, right? So what we have to do is to recognize that there is a conflict-laden environment in which we live. Conflicts are around us whether we want to admit them or not. So what we now need to do is to recognize that in order to live peacefully, in order to do the business as the best we can, what we need to then do is to ensure that we layer in our planning effective arrangements for managing disputes. And when I speak of managing disputes, I'm not just speaking of trying to resolve them when they happen, but I'm speaking as well as putting in preventative or avoidance mechanisms at the front end to manage them so that they don't get worse. And if they get worse, that you have an effective system as well that can come up with to hear the disputes as they arise, deal with them, and then come up with an effective solution that people can live with.
How do we then create a dispute management environment in our mindset, in our thinking, our day-to-day attitude? How do we get there, or how do we get others to get there, even those who are not business oriented, just generally?
I think a lot of that has to do with education, and I think a refocusing as well of how we teach our children. Because I think it is critical that every person, as young as is possible, gets an exposure to the fact that conflicts are a natural part of life.
Right.
You will never live life without encountering conflicts. And so conflicts are not themselves bad. And in fact, it is as a result of conflict that you very often have the best developments happening, because conflicts give rise to what we call contending views. And it is as a result of contention in views and persons then being able to resolve those contentions that arise that you're very often able to come up with solutions which are best able to satisfy the needs of the parties involved, rather than simply having one or another party simply pushing their own views down the throats of another person without an understanding that if you do that, while you may be able to get away with it, it does not mean that you are creating an environment for peace and tranquility. Now that we understand that conflicts are not necessarily bad, what we then now need to do is to help persons to see how best you can manage them, and by managing them, looking at the various options that may be available and trying to help persons to understand what options may work best in what circumstances, and then do what we should do, which is to seek to leverage conflict resolution mechanisms in the best interest of the circumstances that we meet from time to time, be they personal or commercial.
How important is timing when it comes on to this?
The earlier you get to providing for conflict management, the better you are. And if we take that approach, it means that from the moment you conceptualize an idea and you think of how you want to implement it, you should also start thinking of what you need to do to ensure that you have effective measures in place for management of conflict. I always take a risk management approach to conflicts and conflict management, and typically to transactions, generally speaking. And that risk management approach is the same one I would adopt in relation to contracts or anything else. And it's one which says that once you're engaging in a relationship of any type, you need, including personal ones, interestingly enough, you need to sit down and try to identify the risks that are associated with the relationship that you're about to engage in, be it a personal or a commercial. And I get back to the personal in a minute with the risk identification. Having determined what those risks are likely to be, you then need to try to figure out how best those risks may be allocated, right?
Right.
And having then determined who you allocate it to, and allocation typically is done by reference to allocating the risk to the person who is best able to bear it, right? And then having moved beyond that, you then need to think of how can we manage or mitigate these risks in a manner which will enable the end result that we're hoping for to be achieved. So let's just go back to the personal for the minute. Let's say there's a couple or persons thinking of getting into a relationship. Now, at the end of the day, where what you're hoping for is to engage in and enter into a relationship that is successful, right? So that's an end goal which hopefully both parties will have. Person A, being the girl, will start thinking and say, yes, I've seen person B and I have an interest in person B. Here are the things I have noticed about person B. These are the things I like. These are the things I do not like. The things that I like are compatible naturally with who I am. The things that I don't like are not. what have you then identified by so doing? You have identified that the things that you don't like, which are not compatible with you, are likely to be a risk in getting the relationship going to the end result of it being successful. Now that I have looked at this relationship and identified the things that I like, and identified the things as well that I don't like, and the things that I don't like are risks that could result in the relationship breaking down. What can be done in terms of managing those risks related so that we find a way, even if not to get rid of them completely, to ensure that effective measures are put in place to dumb down the effects of those risks on the relationship so as to prevent it going bad, right? The question is, what are the ongoing things that we will be able to do by way of management or mitigation to ensure that the risks don't raise their ugly heads in preventing our ultimate goal of attaining and keeping a successful relationship? So we can take it to that very personal level. Therefore, to translate that into the business, the same sort of things happen. Let's say you have a situation where person A is a business that is in the business of producing timber, right? And person B is in the business of making fine furniture. Then you will look and say, well, here is what happens from person B being the person making the furniture in this instance. You can say, well, person A produces a particular type of timber that I like. However, that timber has a particular difficulty in processing. So it has to be cut in a particular way with the grain or against the grain, as the case may be, right? To allow for me to be able to use it effectively. So what you have now identified is a risk. So what do you then have to do? You have to ensure that measures are put in place that the timber is properly cut, so that when it comes to you for you to manufacture it, you can use it effectively. And what you will then do by way of management or mitigation there is ensure that you have ongoing inspection, if necessary, and other measures being put in place to ensure that the quality control that you desire is maintained. And if you were to do that, the chance of your getting timber, which is unworkable, is reduced, right? Yes. The chance of you getting that is reduced. Yes. The risk of that happening is reduced. And if you reduce the risk of that happening, chances are you will be able to have an ongoing and very successful commercial relationship where timber is produced to you on time and of the quality you desire, because at the outset, you put in place a mechanism that allowed for that to happen. So what I'm saying in short is that when you're thinking of dispute management, getting back to where you are, it is something that you must think of at the outset. Think of the risks that are likely to happen, think of how best to allocate those, and think of putting measures in place that will allow for you to attain your ultimate objectives at the least risk possible of something bad happening that you could have prevented had you done something else.
The JAIAC, of course, provides some assistance in that area in terms of dispute management. Talk to us a little bit about that.
If we think about management, remember, I said that management really involves 3 stages. There is a stage of looking at risk identification, there's a stage of looking at risk allocation, and then there's a stage of looking at risk management. And that management element of it includes at the back end a resolution component. So what the JAIAC does is that the JAIAC now functions in that space of putting in place an administrative arrangement, right? That is not the court, because the court is what you go to as your constitutional right of access. So what the JAIC does is that it allows parties to contractually agree to take their disputes to the JAIC and to have those disputes resolved by reference to the rules of the JAIC. And you can come there using a multiplicity of modalities. You can come there to be able to access our mediation services, or arbitration services, or adjudication services, neutral evaluation, and so on. So the JAIC provides an arrangement through which parties may be able to engage a process for resolving their disputes. They are able to then have access to a panel of dispute resolution practitioners that they can rely upon. They're able to have access to rules that have been devised by the JAIAC to manage the conduct of proceedings. And they're able as well to manage using the online process that is made available, the platform of iNeutral, that they can also use instead of face-to-face. They can use iNeutral as a method of going online fully or in a hybridized way to assist them in how they seek to resolve their disputes when they manifest.
Still ahead in Season 2 of the JAIAC's Dispute Management in a New World podcast series, we continue to explore the concept of dispute management and its pandemic implications. We talk a little bit about small size, big problems, financing development in emerging economies, de-risking of banks and bank customers, understanding the issues on both sides, iNeutral dispute management, innovation and access, value chain economics and the construction industry, smoking hot, cannot talk, conversations about cannabis. Season 2 episodes will include a talkback segment featuring international thought leaders and practitioners who will contribute their unique perspectives and invaluable takeaways. Before we go, here's today's Did You Know fact. Did you know that the JAIAC has been in existence since 2015, offering alternative dispute resolution services to both individuals and companies across the world? Now that's where we wrap things up for today's episode. Please remember to tune in to each of our bi-weekly Dispute Management in a New World podcast episodes available on Buzzsprout, Podbean, Spreaker, and the JAIAC's YouTube channel. It's sponsored by the JDIC, protecting deposits for you and me.
I save because one day my little business is going to be a big deal.
Yeah, and I make sure to put away a little something for him.
And thanks to JDIC, deposit insurance protection on my savings gone up.
You've been upgraded. Deposits held in commercial banks, building societies, and merchant banks are covered under the JDIC deposit insurance scheme up to $1.2 million per depositor per institution. JDIC.
Protecting deposits for you and me.
I'm your host, Anika, saying on behalf of Dr. Christopher Malcolm, thank you for joining us. Special thanks to ADEB Consultants, consulting engineers in the Caribbean for over 57 years. Regis, Work Your Way, Caribbean Institute of Alternative Dispute Resolution, Wassel & Wassel Arbitrator Services Incorporation, iNeutral Dispute Resolution Made Easy, CP Malcolm Dispute Management Practitioner, and Impact Justice, improved access to justice in the Caribbean.
The way we do business has changed. Don't be left behind. Choose a hybrid solution for your workforce. Regis offers furnished, equipped, ready-to-use office space available for days, months, or years. Our fully serviced private office spaces give teams of all sizes an inspiring environment to focus, collaborate, and do their best work. The world is switching to hassle-free hybrid working. Join the revolution. Switch to Regis. Call 876-618-8800 or visit regis.com.jm. That's regus.com.jm.
All our episodes are also distributed on Google Podcasts, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, Deezer, Stitcher, Podcast Index, Pandora, TuneIn Plus Alexa, Podchaser, Podcast Addict, and wherever else you get your favorite podcasts.